So there's tremendous rewards for saying what they want to hear, and there's tremendous punishment for confounding their expectations of what you're going to say. And that's making us all, I worry, become more predictable. And contributing to an environment in which people aren't engaging with each other. They're not debating with each other. They're really just speaking one to many, but it's the same many over and over again. And it discourages the kind of debate that I think you need in a pluralistic society, which is the society we have.
James Bennet is known to many of you as one of the legendary journalists, magazine editors, and now opinion shapers of our time. And I'm very personally grateful and feel very lucky that he can come and spend the day with us. He is the editorial page editor of the New York Times, who's in charge of the opinion department, oversees the editorial board and the letters and op-ed sections. He became editorial page editor in May of 2016. You may recall that was a very quiet time in the life of our country. But before this, he was the president and editor-in-chief of The Atlantic magazine and was a significant transformative leader of a legendary American institution, really is a model of the kind of leadership that news organizations need in a time of so much technological disruption, journalistic disruption, and the success that James had at The Atlantic was really a model for everyone in positions at other magazines and newspapers and networks in trying to figure out how do we transform what we do, moving the values that have guided us into an arena whose shape was changing continuously because of the economic headwinds and the technological opportunities and challenges that were presenting themselves to us. And his leadership at The Atlantic was really not only important for that institution and its audience, but really for all consumers of news and information and feature journalism. Before The Atlantic, he had been a correspondent, a White House correspondent, a Jerusalem bureau chief at the New York Times. Before that, there was a period at the New Republic, and I'm sure I am missing one, but suffice to say, James is one of the unusual journalists who has played multiple roles as a frontline reporter on critical news stories, operating in the real-time pressures of covering a huge story, whether out of Jerusalem or out of the White House or wherever, while also operating at the high altitude of guiding other people's coverage and shaping how we should be understanding our world and the people who are defining and shaping it. And so I think the perspectives that he brings to so many of the challenges that we face in our democracy right now are quite extraordinary, and that's why I am so happy to have you here. So what I was hoping you could do to start out is I often run into some confusion about roles, particularly editorial versus news. Can you explain the structure to us at the New York Times and who talks to whom, who reports to whom, and who is not allowed to sit on the same floor as other people?
Let me say first, thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction, and it's just an honor to be here with you, Nancy, and I'm grateful to all of you for turning out. Thank you. Look forward to your questions and criticisms, thoughts. You're not alone in being confused about the division between news and opinion, if I can take it that way. I have days, too. It's something that we all wrestle with continually at the New York Times. The broadest way I think about it, so the New York Times has, let me take a step back. The broadest way I think about it is that the newsroom really exists to describe the world as it is, and opinion exists to imagine the world as it could be. There's all sorts of overlap in what we do. We both report. We have the same standards for factual accuracy. but where opinion differs is in being able to advocate for specific outcomes. We are separate from the newsroom physically. We're on a different floor. The newsroom now has about 1,400 people in it, which is a phenomenal, wonderful fact about the New York Times in an era where, as you were saying, and maybe we'll talk about this, as we all know, journalism is just going through a tremendous struggle to play the civic role that it needs to play to sustain the democracy. But so the newsroom has 1,400 people. We have about 90. So we're a rather small group within the University of the New York Times, but we do attract, occasionally repel, a very large audience. We don't coordinate editorial strategy. Our editorials, the news side doesn't know what we're working on or what we're writing. We, by and large, don't know what they're up to, and we don't coordinate our coverage.
I had mentioned you had been at the Times before you went to the Atlantic. When you returned to the Times, what surprised you the most?
I came back to what felt like a completely different news organization. It was really astounding. I didn't know quite what to expect, but the Times had been engaged really for the previous half dozen years before I came back in its own effort to do what you were doing at Time, what we were all doing at the Atlantic, and that was a collaborative effort by a lot of people, which is try to take one idea of what the publication was and port that idea over to take full advantage of all the wonderful reporting and distribution tools that are available to us now. So I came back to a New York Times that was pretty further down that road than I expected, and there were a lot of faces there I didn't recognize. There were now hundreds of engineers.
I'm thinking job titles you didn't recognize.
Job titles I didn't know. And where the Times is really, and this is just a tremendous credit to the newsroom, has really been a leader in visual journalism. And actually, there was a term I was hearing used at the New York Times that I think when we were coming up was regarded with some suspicion, which was creativity. Like, creativity is now really valued at the paper in a way that it used to be suspicious of it, and its creativity is applied to storytelling and visual journalism and so forth. So it really was in a way, because I'd kind of grown up at the New York Times. I'd spent 15 years there and was super lucky to sort of move from desk. I was a Metro reporter and a business reporter, a foreign correspondent, magazine writer, and a White House correspondent. So I got to move around a lot, and it was a very unfamiliar, in a really positive way, institution that I came back to. Same core values, the journalism comes before everything else. The integrity of the journalism remains the North Star, but the Times is just doing it in all sorts of new ways.
So one of the early decisions that you made when you took over the editorial operation was to hire Bret Stephens away from the Wall Street Journal. And I think the first column he wrote was about climate science, and it led to a lot of people canceling their subscriptions. So you have spoken, I think, and written eloquently about the whole topic of diversity and what you were looking for in assembling your cast of columnists and in the contributors who you invite to those pages. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you think about that and how you think about your audience reaction to it if some of them essentially are saying, we're not sure we want that diversity?
Yeah, I could bang on about this for a really long time, so please interrupt me if I start wandering. No, seriously, because diversity is a really, it's an incredibly important value that that we could approach from many different angles. But let me back way up. When Adolph Ochs made his original mission statement about the New York Times in 1896, what everybody remembers, and for good reason, is the without fear or favor part, But he also said, in the next breath, he talked about the role of opinion. And he said that the New York Times would promote intelligent discussion from all points of view. And he said that it would do this, and I love this expression, he said it would do this in order to assure the free exercise of a sound conscience, which I think is just a beautiful expression. And to me, what that means is that our role is not to tell people what to think, but it's to help people do what I believe that they really want to do, which is to think for themselves, right? And that the way we do that is convening lots of different points of view. We're trying to make the world a better place by encouraging respectful debate on really big questions. And again, when it comes to opinion, when you're trying to advocate solution, I believe deeply nobody's got all the right answers. And the way we test propositions is in open debate. Now, that means we have been on a diversification project in Times Opinion, which we remain in the middle of, and I wish we're further down the road than we are, my fault. But it's on 4 different axes at once. You mentioned one of them, which is ideology, which is really important. I think there is a real danger that we're we can talk about this more, retreating into our own, a risk of retreating into our own cocoons and only hearing what we want to hear. Ideology is part of it. Identity is a huge part of it. Subject matter is also part of it. We've always cared, been focused on politics and world affairs. Well, the Times is very, we haven't engaged, we've done a lot of great work over the years, but we haven't been engaged as deliberately with other areas of life that are incredibly important to our audience, including the way, for example, technology is changing our lives. So subject matter, third area. And then the fourth, well, I can give you 5. There's also storytelling, and then there's geography. Our people are overwhelmingly weighted to New York and Washington, and we're trying to spread across the country and around the world. So we're trying to do all this stuff at once. And I know to the outside world at times it's looked a little bit messy, and there have been moments when some of our audience pushed back. In general, though, you mentioned canceled subscriptions. I don't know how many subscriptions may have come in as a consequence of this. In general, it's been well received. To take the example of Brett first, he does not deny the science of climate change. I think he's a great columnist, and he's done amazing work for the New York Times, and has taken, the way all our columnists do, he's taken a lot of criticism, but he's stuck to his guns, and I'm grateful to him for that.
I was, about the subscriptions, my understanding at some other news organizations where we now have much better metrics about what stories, not only what kind of traffic they get, but which ones turn people into occasional samplers to regular subscribers. And there's some evidence that actually opinion may drive more subscriptions, may drive more engagement and audience growth than the news. Don't let your newsroom colleagues hear me even asking you this, but...
Oh, no, they hear it from me all the time. I certainly make that argument. I don't know if it's actually true. Again, it's all for debate. No, what we do know is that opinion drives what is now referred to as engagement. People attach to particular writers, or they attach to the debate, and they come back. And that in the model that we now have, that's valuable. I would say, in general, that's valuable. What is wonderful about the environment that the New York Times and other publications, the business model we're moving to, which is a subscription-based model, as you said, Nancy, and away from an advertising-based model, is that the foundation of our business is our relationship with people who are willing to pay for our journalism, which means that all the incentives kind of align. The journalism needs to be good.
Which sounds so obvious, yeah. Except that was not the model for many years.
Yeah, do you want to talk about, the advertising model and the magazine business particularly was a very different beast in a lot of ways. And this is a very healthy development for journalism, but it's a fragile one, and so far only a couple of publications are really making it work. And And that's a deep concern, I think, to all of us. And so I encourage you to subscribe, obviously to the Times, but to whatever your local paper or journalistic outlet you approve of.
Does it concern you how much journalism is increasingly dependent on philanthropy?
It does. I mean, I'm very grateful. I'm really very grateful that people have, that there are billionaires in the world who have decided that part of their mission is to support great journalism. It's been good for Time magazine, and now for the Atlantic. It's tremendously exciting to see what they're doing. I do just worry about whether that's a durable model over the long haul, because it does depend a little bit on the good heart of a particular billionaire and then their heirs. And the project at the Atlantic when I was there was very much to create a sustainable business that would support the kind of journalism we had always done and were aspiring to do. And
you actually made the magazine profitable for the first time in quite a long time.
We did collectively. We got the magazine into the black and solidly, and that was felt really good about its future. And they're continuing, the Atlantic is also moving towards a subscriber-focused model, and that's a really healthy thing. It's always, it was ever thus, and not, the Atlantic, as you all know, was a Boston institution for many years before it moved to Washington. Apologies for that, can't say that often enough. It was never actually a big moneymaker, the Atlantic magazine, and part of what goes with the territory is not expecting that this is not a business you necessarily go into expecting to make a mint, but you do want to create a model that's able to sustain the journalism and grow the journalism.
Does the Times generally, and do you in the editorial operation talk about as news deserts open up in so many parts of the country with real implications for everything from local corruption to the dissemination of misinformation and disinformation in the absence of local news sources, does that introduce to the New York Times a different way of thinking about its obligations for covering parts of the country that would not have traditionally really been a priority?
Yeah, and we talk about this a lot, and I know it's very much on the mind of our publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, and the newsroom leadership, Dean Baquet and Joe Kahn. It's something we've talked about, have not figured out yet, again, because we are very mindful of our own. The existential struggle I've always believed, at whatever publication I've worked at, will never end, and we have to be very mindful of investments we make. We haven't figured out yet how the New York Times might be able to play a role. I've been glad to see there has been some nonprofit engagement now across the country, a couple of really interesting attempts to seed newsrooms that have been depleted with ambitious journalists, and now we've seen Facebook step up and begin to invest a little bit in that. That's all good, but I'm hopeful we'll be able to play more of a role too.
I will say, and this is an advertisement for a future event of the Goldsmith Awards, that in judging this prize for investigative reporting, the caliber of reporting from, in some cases, tiny news operations who were pursuing their mission of holding public authorities accountable and really understanding the challenges faced by those local communities were inspiring, and a real reminder of what is lost when a local paper dies, when a local radio station folds, when a news organization is consumed by a larger chain that then guts the newsroom. There is a cost, certainly, that people in that town pay. I think there's a cost that all of us pay downstream, and so it's pretty much starting on Election Day 2016, our industry launched a kind of soul searching about what had happened what had gone well, what had gone badly, what had been missed, what they would do differently, that continues and accelerates now as we head into another campaign. Can you talk a little bit about how you have thought about how that campaign was treated and what lies ahead of us?
Well, let me say where I felt some personal sense of failure was I think it would have been possible, not entirely, but possible to have read the opinion pages of the New York Times while I was there in the run-up to the election, and then have the election happen and not be able to understand why anybody in the entire country would have possibly voted for Donald Trump. I think it's still hard for some people to understand that, but we probably weren't doing our job properly if we weren't doing a better job of surfacing perspectives for our readers that, I'm talking about the readers who weren't themselves planning to vote for Donald Trump, that maybe would have challenged more their assumptions, like our own assumptions, I guess. So that was definitely one takeaway I had from that experience. I always thought it was possible he'd be elected, but I certainly didn't consider it likely. And in the waning days, we were hearing from all sides, including his own people, the expectation that Hillary Clinton was going to win, which of course she did in the popular vote. What's the second part of the question, Nancy? Is like,
what changes this time?
Well, I think we've all, what changes this time? I mean, I can't really speak for the news side of the paper. We've all, recommitted to our fundamental kind of sense of humility, I hope, about predicting the future or assuming what outcomes could be, and recommitted to the fundamental tools of our trade, which are, curiosity and an open mind, and getting out to talk to people and understand how they see the world. We're certainly trying to do that in opinion. We have been doing that in opinion. So I wouldn't call it so much as of a change as much as a kind of recommitment to the fundamental kind of game we're supposed to be playing.
You potentially face a particular challenge if a close member of your family were to suddenly find himself among the candidates. How do you, without asking you to reveal anything that you may or may not know about your brother's plans, but hypothetically, how does someone in your position handle something like that if that occurs?
It's certainly a complexifier, to use the word that Jeff Bezos used the other day. This is my brother, Michael Bennet, is the senior senator from Colorado, and he was in Iowa over the weekend.
It's a very suspicious vacation spot.
In
February.
As was the mayor of New York and the former governor of Colorado. So it's a good time to be an Iowan, I suppose, or maybe not. Yeah, I mean, we've said just last week, it's I don't know of any precedent for this situation, and I will, if Michael does form an exploratory committee and choose to get in, and I will recuse myself from all our political coverage.
So how does that work?
Yeah.
That's kind of a big story.
You think it's going to be a big story?
I think it's a big story. I don't know. Don't hold me to it. That's predictive, and I'm not in the prediction business. But
it's just, fortunately, I have two partners in running the opinion operation. Katie Kingsbury, who oversees the editorial board, Jim Dow, who oversees the op-ed team. The three of us kind of do a little bit of everything, and they're more than able to manage without me interfering. I'm a little worried, actually, now that I say that, this could expose my irrelevance. That now that I think about one outcome of this. But the other thing is we have a ton of other stuff to do. We are, as I was trying to say, I've got a lot on my plate in terms of the continuing evolution of the department, which I can talk about more. We have made a very big investment in the last year in our technology coverage. Farhad Manju joined our team, Sarah Jung joined our team, Kara Swisher joined our team. We've got Charlie Wardzell is coming from BuzzFeed and starting next week, and this is super exciting to me, and I'm going to be putting a lot of my attention there and in international coverage and so forth and so on, and trying to assert that I still have something to contribute. If this happens, and as you say, it remains hypothetical.
So in the fall, I teach a class on the politics of the press, and I had spent quite a lot of time building my elaborate syllabus, and then the second week of class, you published an anonymous op-ed by a senior administration official. Some of you will remember this, and that pretty much derailed my class for the rest of the semester because what became clear from that day on is that what was happening in real time in the relationship between politics and the press as institutions and as individuals was like nothing we have seen, and whatever was happening was going to be much more interesting than whatever I had planned. So can you talk a little bit about that decision at the time and in retrospect to publish it, and what are the tensions that decision introduced?
Yeah, I mean, it is something we've done before, but we do very, very rarely for the obvious reason. But we've done it when we felt it was necessary to protect someone whose perspective we thought was valuable for our audience and would not be heard otherwise. And in this case, we thought not that there was no news in that piece, and there had been certainly anonymous quotes in our paper and others in news stories that had given a sense of the perspective of some of the people who work for Donald Trump. But what this particular essay did, I think, was explain from the point of view of someone on the inside why they felt it was the right thing to do to be serving this administration, even though they had a lot of qualms about what the president was doing. And one of the reasons was that they actually believed in a lot of what the president was doing and wanted to support that agenda. Another was that they felt they were in a position to help with others to restrain some of what they saw as his worst impulses, or worse and more dangerous in their point of view impulses. And the piece did start it started a guessing game, which was not, in my view, constructive, but it did start what I thought was a really useful debate about whether those compromises made sense or not. And I think that was a contribution.
Well, not surprisingly, at a school of government, it was a very rich opportunity to talk about when do you stay, when do you go, when do you serve, what are the breaking points. And in the case of your writer, so much depends in the value of that piece and the perspective that it lent on the level of seniority and the future ambitions of the writer, which were known only to you and not to your readers. So how do you reconcile the value that you think it gives readers when they don't have some crucial information about how to judge the perspective that was being shared?
Nancy, I can't engage too far on that question. All I can say is we thought really deeply about all these considerations, and again felt that although we're always reluctant to supply anonymity in any case, that this was a valuable point of view that wouldn't be heard otherwise. And yeah, you're right. In any administration, there are people who make compromises of one sort or another in order to serve, and that's not unusual. I do think there are a number of people inside this administration for whom that traditional choice feels much more intense, heightened, and we wanted to convey that.
I mean, this topic really seemed to me to reach its boil around Jim Mattis's decision to resign, of the point at which, how, to what extent could he justify continuing his role at the Pentagon? At what point did that become untenable if his influence was not making a difference in policy? But I think you're right that it has been an unusual situation to have this debate over, is it ever ethical to sabotage an administration that you work for that was duly elected by, in a democratic system of government? What are the circumstances in which your obligation, if you want to denounce policy, is then to do it publicly and to resign versus to remain? That those tensions were fascinating and in some ways unprecedented in this one. But I thought that we mainly discussed it from the point of view of the policymakers' decision-making, but from the point of view of a newspaper's decision-making, I thought it was a particularly interesting challenge for all of you. And in a way, I wonder if you're surprised that this many months later, the author has still not been identified, because it's very hard to keep secrets in this day and age.
I've got nothing to say about that one way or the other.
Fair enough. You talked about the axes of diversity that you were looking for, and one that is sort of embedded in all of them that you didn't mention that I'm curious about is a generational question, where it feels as though many of our political fault lines and cultural and social ones are now cutting along generational lines. And I'm wondering how that plays into everything from your decisions about the role of technology as a central coverage area to not just what you write about, but who's doing the writing.
Yeah, and also in terms of the audience we want to reach. I fold that in under identity, which becomes an umbrella that covers an awful lot. But that's very important, and actually one of the really big challenges journalism faces generally, I think, right now, is that part of the kind of, to use a very strong word, apocalypse that really has hit local newspapers across the country, and now even a lot of the pure play digital publications that have started in recent years, is that the pipelines for growing journalists are all being disrupted. And disrupted is the wrong word because it's now got a positive valence. Destroyed, right? Like, who's growing journalists now? And so the answer is journalism schools have a bigger role to play than they ever did, I think, in this environment. We have a greater obligation, I think, also to be thinking about this, and not just thinking about it, but doing it. So yes, part of it is bringing in people. We need super experienced people who've been around the block and have gained a sense of proportion from that, and a sense of history, although actually some of our youngest people have a great sense of history too. But we really need a mix, and so that's been part of the project. And people who, and again, it is not entirely a generational question, because there are people of my generation and more senior who know how to write for the web, who have a very adventurous and experimental mindset, and have taken to it brilliantly. So I don't really like to paint with too broad a brush here, but we need people who are comfortable operating in that environment, writing with a voice that's more digitally native, and in all these sorts of ways it makes our work stronger. And because diversity of viewpoint matters so much to the quality of our work and the range of our arguments over time, we need to have people at the table with a very different generational viewpoint as well, and we have that now, actually.
So you just talk about writing for the web and the skills that go with that, and I'm curious because your digital audience has been growing enormously, there are growing numbers of people like me who are only digital subscribers, who are much less likely to see the physical New York Times. And so I don't know what you've decided to put on the front page if you're a news editor, and I don't know which of the columns you're publishing you decided to print or not. How much does that matter to me as a reader, to you as an editor?
I'll say something I shouldn't say, which is that some days I don't know either. Partly because I'm so accustomed now to reading on my phone, and we've kind of worked to flip our operation a little bit so that we're publishing first to the web and then composing the best mix. The objective is to then compose the best mix for the printed product based on what we've already created. Does that partly reflect what does well when it's posted, or is it? No, actually. No, because you could wind up with a bunch of pieces all in the same subject that way. If there was a huge news story that day and everybody weighed in, a Donald Trump-related thing, then you could wind up with everything being, and that's not a very satisfying, as a magazine editor, you would never want to present a reader with, unless it was a special issue, I suppose. So no, we're looking for a mix. And some of our columnists always appear in print on particular days. That remains true. We're gradually, it's going to take a long time, moving away from that model too. I have not found, when we've moved a columnist from one day to another, I've not found that our readers react. They're just happy to find that person whenever they find them. And you might have noticed that some will appear and not appear other times, or appear with a much longer piece than a traditional column. I do think, look, part of what we have been doing, for way too long, in opinion, and this is not anybody's fault, it's just the way things existed, our journalism was kind of organized around the production requirements of the printed newspaper. So what does that mean? That meant that columns had to be 800 words long, and they had to be delivered by a certain time on a certain day, and it meant we editorialized 3 times a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Why? Because that's what was required to fill a column in the printed newspaper. Now, print is a valuable forcing factor. I always felt this at the Atlantic too, and so there's value to that. I don't diminish all of it. But when you think about it, that's a really pretty stupid reason to do journalism, right? Like, you should be writing at the length at which you have something to say, whether it's 300 words or 3,000 words, or maybe 23,000 words. And you should be writing when you have something to say, not just because you got to fill the print paper. So one of the exciting things for me is to kind of move away from those old those old habits and develop kind of new ways of thinking about when and how we work. So, for example, editorials, if I could just talk about that for a second, sorry. If you guys know, the editorials are the unsigned pieces that run in the paper. And as I said, our tradition, which is wonderful and powerful and has a lot of value, was to do 3 a day. And my colleagues and I have really worked, kind of come to the view that we should try to use the institutional voice more sparingly, to use it when we really feel like we have something to say, and not just to comment on the day's news, unless it's really important news where we feel like we could lend some real value, and instead focus our efforts more on reporting, enterprise, and editorials that explain as well as kind of conclude and advise. And so we've been, you may have noticed, if you're a print reader, particularly, look, I am too. I don't mean to say I'm not. Now we'll sometimes, we'll often editorialize only once a day, sometimes not at all. Our people are doing more work under their own bylines as opinion writers. Sometimes we'll do it 2 a day. We did today. We very seldom 3 a day, but the goal is to be able to use that time and that space to do a more distinctive kind of journalism. And you've seen my colleagues on the editorial board do a couple of huge projects in the last year, including a big series we're really proud of. At the end of last year on kind of the rise of the idea of fetal rights in the U.S. and the way that's eroding in a way I think we're not quite conscious of always yet at the national level in a lot of state capitals, women's rights without society really making a very deliberate choice here. And we've also done work like my colleague Brent Staples on the editorial board, who again is one of our most senior members. He's been there with tremendously valuable experience. He's been doing a lot of byline pieces. He's really a historian by disposition, by orientation, and I just think there's so much great journalistic work to do, kind of breaking news to us about our own history and challenging a lot of the myths we have. And he's done a wonderful series. He's just been doing a wonderful series, some as unsigned editorials, some under his own byline, about the suffrage movement, for example, and how black women have kind of been written out of the history of the suffrage movement, and a piece on, really powerful piece he did on Sugar Land, Texas, and the experience where a you guys may have seen this, a cemetery was discovered that demonstrated, the way the convict lease program was actually in some ways even worse than slavery for African Americans, and what the evidence on the skeletons that were unearthed there told us about that history and the effort of this town to grapple with that history. Now, if Brent was writing just a 500-word editorial every day about the latest outrage, we'd never get that piece. So that's what we're kind of working towards, and I find it, I feel very lucky to be working with these folks and seeing them do this kind of work.
I want to turn this over to you, but I have one last question, because we confirmed just before we started that we share an allergy of a certain kind to Twitter. And so I wonder if you can talk a little about not your own tweeting habits or lack thereof, but about the impact you see it having on journalism, and particularly on younger journalists who have their tweet deck open at all times and feel like if they haven't tweeted 10 times a day, they haven't done their job.
I used to love Twitter. I won't talk about my own habits, but I have kind of run away from it or given up on it in the last year or so. And I worry in general, and we can attribute everything to social media, and I don't mean to, but I do think in this area it has had a real impact, and I worry it's making opinion journalism in particular less interesting. And opinion writers, as I'm trying to hire some, less interesting, because the rewards for saying the thing everybody wants you to say, everybody being your particular followers and community, and let me stipulate, there's a ton of value to that community too. The downside is what I'm now describing, in my view. So there's tremendous rewards for saying what they want to hear, and there's tremendous punishment for confounding their expectations of what you're going to say. And that's making us all, I worry, become more predictable. And contributing to an environment in which people aren't engaging with each other. They're not debating with each other. They're really just speaking one to many, but it's the same many over and over again. And it discourages the kind of debate that I think you need in a pluralistic society, which is the society we have, like it or not. And I think that's a real danger to us over the long haul. But I am seeing this particular thing, like the heterodox journalist who's willing to. There are problems the other way, but it used to be in opinion journalism back in the day, and now I'm like the 80s and 90s, the rewards were for being contrarian. And there were people who were contrarian for the sake of contrarian, and that gets old really, really fast. But we've gone the other direction, and some days I do worry we're at risk of kind of living in an age with a new kind of radical conformity, and not a broad spectrum conformity, but conformity in different niches. And it's something we're trying to row against. Just to plug one other product from Times Opinion, if I could, we started a podcast late last year called The Argument. One of the problems that we've got that I really struggle with talking about traditional forms is that it does feel like we're telling people what they should think when you receive a column, right? Because every column on the internet is an atom, right? It's its own story. You're not seeing the piece that disagrees with it that we publish a few days later. As somebody who's not deeply engaged with the New York Times, you don't know that piece is part of a running conversation or debate that's never going to end. An open-minded debate among colleagues who really disagree but kind of respect each other. And we're looking for ways to solve that so that you kind of have more of a sense of how those pieces fit. But we started this podcast, which is called The Argument. Audio is a wonderful way compared to some of these other forms to demonstrate that. So we put three of our columnists, Ross Douthat, who's quite conservative, Michelle Goldberg, who's more liberal, quite a bit more liberal, and David Leonhardt, who's center-left, together to basically do what we're supposed to be doing, which is to kind of fight with each other about big ideas in a kind of collegial way. And the audience response to it has been wonderful. Like, I don't know that the Daily is a gigantic, wonderful news podcast that reaches a huge number of people, but I do think the people who are listening to these guys, and they had a very direct argument about abortion rights the other day. It was like nothing I've heard. They didn't come to a happy place of agreement at the end of it, but they did surface a lot of the basic fundamental ideas, and they did. It was really Michelle and Ross. They did concede some validity in each other's arguments as they went along, and I do think there's tremendous value in that. And sorry, I'm talking way too much. I worry a lot that we're losing sight of the importance of that kind of engagement.
Well, no, it's easy to, given all the ways that technology has destroyed business models and made life harder, the ways in which these technologies and platforms and storytelling tools have greatly amplified our ability to reach audiences and in different ways, I think is an important. Over to you all. Remember, please identify yourself before you ask a question. Yes.
Hi, I'm Bruce Schneier. I teach here,
sure.
and I teach op-ed writing at the Berkman Center. I've noticed something different in the past year I want to comment on. I regularly told students to pitch queries. And the past year, I've found that editors are not responding. Not just you, but Atlantic and Wired and CNN and Washington Post and New Yorker and Vice, that previously they'd get rejected or accepted, and now not even a response. Is there a change that's happening in op-ed offices around the country that I'm not aware of?
First, thank you for your work very much. No, and I'm sorry. We get pitched a lot. We always have, but I thought I'd get asked this question, so I was talking to Jim Dow, the op editor, about this yesterday, and his estimate is about 1,000 pitches a week. To a relatively small team. And a team that is tasked with, by the way, I mean, this is one of the real dangers of the op-ed world, is that you could spend all your time, responding to pitches. So 1,000 pitches a week and maybe 80 pieces a week, right? And you could spend all your time just doing that and pick out the ones you want to run and feel like you've done your job, and you won't have done your job. because you won't have gone out and found new writers, and you won't have thought of new ideas. You wouldn't have convinced somebody who never thought they would be published in the New York Times that, yes, we are open for business from you, and we want your voice to be heard. So maybe we've been making more of an effort to do that, and maybe one of the consequences is we're a little less reliable about responding.
If I introduce them, they'll get a response. And if I send the email, here's a new voice, internet, you haven't heard, it's a good piece, please read it, they'll respond. But and this has happened again and again.
And not just us, you're saying.
And you guys are always marginal, but CNN, Washington Post, Atlantic, they used to always respond.
To suggest everyone's volume.
I do think we have a disclaimer, because we've always been marginal, that says we won't necessarily get back to you, which I know is not. We just published a piece from Adam Grant saying it's inexcusable not to answer your email. Did you see it? It made me feel so bad.
What? About why it's okay.
Well, yeah, we did. We had a little debate about it, but it's the volume is. I wonder if it's a function of fewer outlets, too. Maybe the volume is going up because there are fewer places to put those pieces.
That is true.
And publishing yourself on the web is a less effective approach than it used to be. I wonder if that's happening. I don't know. I'll take that one, Bruce. I'll talk to Jim about it and see. But, thanks for raising it.
Yes.
My name is Hal Shubin. I'm a member of the general public. I'm a user experience designer. My work is to make software easier to use, basically. And as a lover of print news and a user experience designer, I'm concerned about the move from print to the web, to online news, because I'm concerned that people will just be reading less. I think it's harder to take in as much, harder to read much, and I think people are going to wind up being a little less informed. What do you think about that?
I'm worried about that. By the way, I'm a huge believer in print, and print isn't going anywhere at the New York Times. I mean, it continues to be to use a terrible expression, viable product for us. There are a lot of people who love it, and we're going to keep it going as long as those people are out there. And I was a big believer in it at the Atlantic as well, which continues to publish a print magazine. And one of the reasons the user experience in print is just not been replicated yet digitally, and we just haven't gotten there. And we talk about this constantly, but that ability you have when you receive the paper. You've got a series of section fronts, and there's a hierarchy. Everybody understands of what people think is what's our best stuff, what we think is the important stuff, and you can flip through it and see it at a glance. We haven't on the phone. We haven't, and then you can just dip into it and have that wonderful serendipitous experience of discovery. Please.
Serendipity is one of the things that nobody's really developed very well online. Right, the card catalog in the library was the best example of that in the whole world, and it just doesn't come across online very much. So, are you working on other models for how to do it?
Yeah, it's something that we are very focused on. I can't say we've cracked it, but it's again, in a world where we're trying to convince people, we need to persuade people every day and win that conversation that we're producing journalism worth paying for. We want them to know about the amazing piece we published from Afghanistan that day that maybe has been crowded off the home screen because of some development in Washington that is the news of the day. And how do you make sure people are, and it's important information that they need to know. How are we surfacing that for them? And it's something we're working on really hard. I do worry that part of what's happening, though, is that, as you said, reading habits are really changing, and we're moving from that kind of experience in the morning to a kind of interstitial reading that takes place all day long in grocery store lines or while you're waiting for an elevator, and it's that brief kind of, and that's a very different experience and a tough one to overcome. One thing we need to do is be super interesting. Like, you know, I mean, it's on us. It can't. It's about product. It's also about storytelling, and it's about headlines, and it's about competing for people's attention in a world where they've got a gazillion distractions.
But on a 3-inch screen.
On a 3-inch screen. For now, right? I mean, but yes, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. My name is Monte Maitake, and I'm a Roma rights activist from Romania, but also a student here at the Kennedy School. I've been reading the New York Times for many years, and I cannot tell you how relieved I am to see that when I read an article now, I don't have to see the gypsy terminology all over the place. And at the same time, I'm very grateful for the articles that are talking about anti-Romani racism in Europe and all that. But I think that there is one piece where I would like to hear your thoughts about, and that's about the voice of the silent peoples and the voices of minorities as part of the New York Times comments and interviews and articles. Is there an intentional view on how to include more voices of the silenced people in the New York Times?
There is, and part of that is through reporting, but part of it for us in opinion goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is some of the new tools we have available. They're not so new anymore, but there's certain people that just are never going to write an op-ed for the New York Times, right? And this is part of overcoming our over-reliance or over-rotation on traditional forms, right? They're never going to write a conventional op-ed. But what we've been playing around with in the last year particularly is video op-eds, as well as some audio work, but really video op-eds. You know, again, a little late to the game, but I'm really excited about the work my colleagues are doing there, partly because it's enabling us to get voices we would otherwise never get on our platform. And for example, they did a really very powerful piece about from a victim of prison rape in jails in Louisiana, asking the question, why is this something people still joke about on late night television, and describing his own experience. That would not have been probably a text op-ed for us. They did a piece from China, using a Chinese journalist who had worked in technology, and she was pointing out, and we had archive footage of these ads that Chinese tech companies run to hire engineers who are basically all male. And the ads are unbelievably sexualized and sexist. I mean, actually with women dancing around poles basically saying, I love a guy who codes. And after we ran that, Tencent, I think it was, apologized, and several of them took down those ads, and it had real impact. We wouldn't have done that as a text-based piece, and if we had, it wouldn't have had nearly the same impact. So we are making a deliberate effort, and we're using video in particular as a way to get voices that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Well, I won't go on and on about it, but there are a number of examples. So we're working towards it, which isn't to say we're where we should be yet.
We're almost out of time. Can I ask, only if you were a student, raise.
Yeah.
Right. In the back.
Hi, I'm Renee. I'm from Jerusalem. And Israel has become an extreme case of the difficulty of saying or writing an opinion that criticizes the actions of the government without being perceived as criticizing Israel, or even worse, being anti-Semitic. What are your thoughts as an editor about how this discussion can be framed in a way that does not fall into these two options of either being for Israel or totally against Israel? How can you build a loving criticism in an effective way?
Do you mind, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but would you mind, how big an issue is this here these days? Israel generally, is it?
For Jews and Israelis?
No, I mean in general on campus here. Is it something?
I don't know. I'm Israeli, so for me, obviously, it's
Yeah,
very big.
okay, fair enough.
But I think this year and here in this campus, I'm not saying it, so I'm not feeling it so strongly. But definitely as someone who, my work and my life is about loving Israel and criticizing it, I'm facing a lot of difficulties in presenting these opinions and voices in a way that does not immediately seem to be anti-Israel, because it's not about anti, it's about making it better.
So we've like some other super sensitive issues, this is a difficult one for people to wade in on. However, we have been doing it pretty aggressively, and not frivolously. Our people are not glib about this, but I don't know if you've seen, we've had a rather vigorous debate in our pages recently about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and we've had a couple of our columnists taking a position that it's not, others that it is. And actually on the podcast I mentioned earlier, two of them, Brett Stevens and Michelle Goldberg, had an argument about this very question. I think it's just really important to engage that directly. You know, it's one of the things we struggle with. What's inbounds, what's out of bounds? Pretending that debate isn't happening doesn't serve our readers, you know, is my view in the end. And it goes a little bit back to the Trump thing we were talking about earlier. And we need to engage it forthrightly. You know, so that's what we're doing, you know, and we're going to continue to do. I don't know if, am I addressing your question?
I was hoping for a magic bullet, but I guess
that's why we debate these things, right? Because there aren't easy answers, and we don't necessarily know what the solutions are, and sometimes it's even scary to imagine. But I do think it's just core to our job to not look away, and to forthrightly take this stuff on.
Thank you, James. This, if it wasn't already clear before you all came into the room, is why we, I think, as citizens and readers, have reason to be grateful that such an important role is in the hands of someone so thoughtful. So I'm grateful for you sharing what you've shared with us.